Hi, I'm Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects, aka The Rig Doctor, and today we're going to look at what I think Jimi Hendrix might have been using if he were still around. Let's check it out. Jimi Hendrix is one of my favorite all-time guitar players, and certainly has influenced some of the guitar players that got me in to even learning about guitar in the first place. Guys like Kenny Wayne Shepherd, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Doyle Bremhall, Phillip, Sayce, all these guys were all influenced heavily by Jimi Hendrix. And certainly I've been influenced by Jimi Hendrix by proxy just because I'm into those guys. Actually, I found about Jimi Hendrix after I found out about Stevie Ray Vaughan, so I kind of came into it backwards. But today I really want to explore the gear that was out there at the time and how his gear evolved over his short professional career, being known as Jimi Hendrix and not just a sideman in the Chitlin circuit. I really want to get into some of the gear he was using and then what some of his followers were using and how they carried the torch, how their gear evolved, and how that might tie back in to what Jimi might have been using had he not died prematurely in 1970. So first things first, let's just look at Jimi Hendrix's gear kind of commonly as it's known. So first of all, pretty much always using a Stratocaster. Of course, every once in a while you'll see him with the Flying V or some other type guitars, maybe sometimes an SG or a Les Paul, but typically he's using a Strat. Long coily cable, plenty of capacitance to go around. Then he's got a fuzz face, he's got a Univibe, he's also got an octave in some cases, and then that's going into a Marshall Super Lead, 100 watt, sometimes multiple 100 watt Marshall Super Leads. And let's not forget, always a Vox wah-wah pedal. Now, that's a pretty basic setup by today's standards, but if you think about it in terms of the number of pedals that were out during that time, and really if we're thinking about his recording career as the artist Jimi Hendrix, that was roughly from the mid-60s to 1970. So depending on kind of how you evaluate it, you could say that there's somewhere between 3 to 5 years of time where he was really putting out records and was really known as Jimi Hendrix and not just a sideman for other bands and other touring acts. Now in that short time, if we're thinking about the pedals as really being wah, fuzz, octave, Univibe, we're really only talking about 4 effects, and there maybe were only 10 to 15 effects even out during that generation or that era. So kind of judging by that standard, it was almost like he had 40% of the effects that were even really available or used in a live setup on his actual rig at that time. So it would have been pretty pervasive. I mean, in today's numbers, if you had 40% of the pedals that were on the market, it could be hundreds of pedals, right? So he definitely was not afraid of using pedals and utilizing the technology that was available at the time. But I think one important person to look at in terms of where Hendrix might have evolved to is Stevie Ray Vaughan, a self-proclaimed Hendrix fanatic. Now, Stevie Ray wasn't that much more complicated than Jimi Hendrix in terms of his rig. He certainly used more varieties of amplifiers and throughout time was known to have used super reverbs, vibro verbs, Dumble steel string singers, Marshall majors. He had a myriad of amps and often would use multiple amps at one time. He had a big amp splitter that was made by his tech, Cesar Diaz. But in terms of pedals, it was usually pretty brief. It was tube screamers, it was sometimes fuzzes, sometimes octaves. Definitely a wah-wah pedal the same way that Jimi Hendrix would have used. Often he would use a Leslie on certain songs like Cold Shot, but really there weren't too many other things. I mean, he had some reverb, of course, because a lot of his amps included reverb on board, which Jimi Hendrix didn't use. But all in all, pretty simple setup. But I think based on that, we could definitely see that maybe Jimi Hendrix would have used something like a tube screamer later on in his career. Typically, Strats and tube screamers are going together like peanut butter and jelly. If you pair that with a Fender-style amp, you're even more in the zone in terms of those classical Strat tones. I think we could definitely presume that Jimi would have probably been using a tube screamer at some point in his career had he not died so young and prematurely. But another artist that I want to look at is Doyle Bremhall, another guy who definitely has the Hendrix vibe, left-handed player, definitely has a lot of similarities in that regard with Jimi Hendrix. Now this is a guy that was influenced also by Stevie Ray Vaughan, but also consequently by Jimi Hendrix. Definitely a guy who's using Univibes, using things like the Chennai Vibro, also the Sir Henry, the Tinsley Audio Univibe, a great one. But then we saw him getting into some little more experimental types of fuzzes and distortion and overdrive devices. He had the Zonk machine, which is a really cool fuzz. We've also seen him use the Prescription Electronics Experience pedal, which has fuzz and octave and a cool swell feature on it as well. I think that Prescription Electronics just generally would have been something that, was certainly inspired by Jimi Hendrix. I think you could definitely see where Jimmy might like the vibe of those certain types of pedals. They were definitely paying homage to stuff that was done in the 60s, kind of fuzzes, univibes, and other types of effects of that nature. I think we also see from Doyle, he's using a classic Vox wah. I think he's got kind of a modified wah, like an oxbow, but I also know he's used vintage Vox wahs and vintage crybabies throughout his career, as did Stevie Ray Vaughan, so it's likely that we would have seen Hendrix probably stay on with a lot of those classic wah pedals, or maybe just upgraded to something that was a little bit more tour worthy or robust with something like the Oxbow, a newer, more refined version that's really paying homage to the vintage wahs, but updating it in a little bit more new and reliable package. I think the other thing that we see from Doyle is he's definitely using things in the Tube Screamer vein. Earlier days, he might have used a Tube Screamer, but a lot of times on his rig now, I'm seeing the Jesse Davies gear, like the Duelist, the Soloist, things of that nature. I could definitely see Jimmy being into that vibe because it's got some of those Tube Screamer type things. If you listen to Jesse Davies play, as I've said in other videos, that guy nails that Hendrixy, Stevie Ray Vaughan type sound. I could definitely see where he would be into this sort of thing, and playing wise really lends itself to kind of some of that Hendrix essence. The other thing we see in Doyle's rig is he's got some really nice kind of Echoplex style pedals. Now I see in his latest rig he's using an EM5, which by many is considered to be the sleeper Echoplex pedal of its day. I definitely think that we would have seen Hendrix using some more Echoplex type stuff. He definitely was getting into some reverse delays and things like that on some of his albums, but I think we could definitely assume that there would be some delay at some point involved in his rig. And certainly as players evolved into 80s and 90s, delay became more prominent even on blues guitar player rigs. And we saw things like the DL4 used by Doyle Bremhall early on when he was touring with Eric Clapton. We also saw the DL4 was used heavily with Phillip Sayce, who's another player I'm going to talk about in just a second. But let's look at Phillip Sayce. We can almost see he's like replicated the same thing that Jimmy, Stevie, Doyle kind of has. He's got that wah up front, a huge wah freak, loves those vintage wahs. That was certainly a mainstay. Old Tube Screamer, definitely like Stevie Ray Vaughan. I think we can assume that Hendrix probably would have followed suit at some point with that. Uses the Univibe, the KR Mega Vibe, just a different way to go as opposed to the Sir Henry or the Chennai. And then also using things like fuzz, octave fuzz, using some tremolo, had the Cesar Diaz tremolo on his rig for a time, had the Cesar Diaz square face on there for a time, has used Tycho Brahe octaves. We could definitely see that some of those same staples and sort of more modern pedals, like using something like the Chicago Iron octave pedal, which is a high quality representation of the classic Tycho Brahe Octavia, using things like, again, the square face from Cesar Diaz, who was Stevie Ray Vaughan's old tech, using his pedal line. And we don't want to forget about Roger Mayer. He was the tech for Jimi Hendrix and came out with his own pedal line and has some really amazing effects that arc back to some of those 60s sounds, has a univibe called the Voodoo Vibe, has some different fuzzes and preamps, and he has those rocket ship shaped effects like his octave. We can certainly bet that Jimi Hendrix would have been supporting his tech had he come out with some of those devices when Jimmy was still alive. Now, another player that I think we should touch base on, who definitely, by many people's standards, definitely embodies sort of the vibe and style of Hendrix, is Michael Landau. Now, although he was a studio musician and didn't always get an opportunity to show off his Hendrix-style chops, if you ever listen to the Raging Honkies records, you can see the inspiration that Michael Landau gets from Jimi Hendrix in terms of the strat tones, in terms of the fuzz and overdrive tones and the octave tones. Absolutely insane, beautiful univibe, just like fat tones that just scream Jimi Hendrix. And one of the things that we see Michael Landau often use to get some of those, of course, is the fuzz face, classical Jimi Hendrix type thing. Also uses a wah, but we also see that Landau uses the Roger Mayer Voodoo 1 quite a bit, which is kind of a preamp type sound that he likes to use up front in his rig. And having built some rigs for Michael in the past, I can tell you that he relies on that heavily. Equally, he's a big user of the SD9, which is a Maxon sonic distortion. And this thing really sounds great and dynamic and kind of bridges the gap between what I call a fuzz face and a tube screamer. And it kind of balances this place between the two of them. Using that Voodoo 1 into it just makes it absolutely magical. And he's another guy that also used a Tycho Brahe Octavia. Definitely goes all in on those Hendrix tones. I highly recommend you check out a video of Michael Landau playing at a trade show in Japan with Robert Bradshaw as they're taking some of the custom audio electronics line to Japan, and you can hear him play some Jimi Hendrix songs just solo, and it just screams Hendrix, just flying off his fingers. All the tones are there. It's a really, really cool listen. You definitely want to listen to it to hear how he's implementing an 80s, 90s era rack rig, getting those Hendrix tones, kind of taking some of those staple sounds and implementing it in kind of more of a modern vibe. Another player that I think we should look to, and I think the last kind of critically important player that we should be looking to, is Kenny Wayne Shepherd. Again, another guy who was influenced by Stevie Ray Vaughan, but definitely also by Hendrix, using a lot of the same exact stuff, using vintage style wahs, fuzzes, using tube screamers, using clones in some cases. And I think we can make a case that Jimi Hendrix might have also had a clone at some point because we know how great they sound with Strats. I think we see things like the King of Tone used in his rig, which also could have been something that we would have seen Jimi Hendrix use. I think presumably if Jimi Hendrix were spending more time stateside, he might not have been relying on the Marshall so much and might have gotten more into some of the American amplifiers. And we did see him use Fenders from time to time in studio contexts, even in some live contexts. But I think we might have seen him rely further on Fender type instruments if he was more stateside at that time, as Marshalls weren't as common in the United States as they were in the UK, where Jimmy was doing a lot of his recording and was heavily touring in Europe throughout that time between the mid-60s and the 70s. But I think to wrap this all up, what would Jimmy realistically be using? I think we're starting at the beginning of the signal path. We can of course say Strat. Pretty much all the players that we talked about, whether it's Doyle Bremhall, Phillip Sayce, Kenny Wayne Shepherd, Stevie Ray Vaughan, any of these players were all using Strats. They still continue to use Strats primarily. I think we could have presumed that Jimmy would have stayed there. I think in terms of amplifiers, I think maybe Marshalls, but I think it could have just as easily morphed into some versions of American amps, Fender style amps as well. But even those classic Marshalls weren't particularly dirty. And I think a lot of people confuse that there's actually a pretty clean amp, and he was relying heavily on his fuzzes in order to get that dirt sound out of the Marshall. I think we can know for sure that he was definitely going to be sticking with some sort of vintage wah. All the guys that carried the torch from him still stayed in either vintage wahs or getting high quality replicas of vintage wahs that they used. I think the other thing we see universally is they were all using Univibes. Now, a new Univibe can sound really great, especially if you get a great one made by guys like Tinsley Audio, the Sir Henry Vibe, the Vibro, which was also designed by the guy that made the Tinsley Audio Sir Henry. So I think that you can get a great vibe from either one of those. Of course, there's some other ones out there that are wonderful as well. Deja Vibe is a high quality replica that might be worth your time if you want to spend a little bit less money. Equally, I think we would have still seen the fuzz face, whether it's a vintage fuzz face or some sort of replica. Jesse Davies makes some great ones. Even the Dunlop ones are pretty great if you didn't have the money to go for a vintage one. I think we definitely would have seen tube screamers in there, Klons, maybe even Kings of Tone in there. I think we could even have seen a duelist in there from Jesse Davy that was involved in there somehow. I think we would have also seen the Roger Mayer effects involved here. Certainly because Roger was his tech, he would have been probably trying to support Roger in some way by using some of his devices. Certainly Michael Landau makes a good case for the use of the Voodoo 1 or the Voodoo Vibe, but also the octaves from Roger Mayer were great. I think we could have seen some of those used in Hendrix's rig. Certainly Stevie Ray Vaughan was a guy that was using similar octave pedals in his rig. Also, it's possible that we would have seen delay. A lot of the later guitar players in the 90s and 2000s that kind of emulated a lot of that vibe were using delay pedals, whether that was the DL4 or using some sort of tape echo style simulator. Doyle Bremhall, a big user of the EM5, the Sound Tank era Ibanez pedals that really nailed that type of tape echo sound. I think we could have seen Hendrix might have used something like that, but who knows? But I'm not as confident about those particular pedals as I am with the drive, fuzz, Univibe type stuff, wah pedals. I'm confident on those that we would have seen quite a few of those overlap with the gear that he used. And I think that there's still quite a few players around that might indicate to us where he might have gone should he have not died so young and so prematurely, and what gear he might have been using if he were still around today. So that was my wrap up of what Hendrix would be using if he were still around today. And I hope you enjoyed it, and I'd love to hear from you about maybe pieces of gear that I might have omitted, or things that you might think that would even improve upon some of the suggestions that I made here, or some of the different devices that I mentioned. Please put that in the comments. We would love to hear from you. And if you want to support us further, you can always head over to the Vertex website and buy a pedal from us. We have lots of great pedals there that we manufacture that I think you would really dig. Also, if you want to support, you can always join us over on Patreon. We have a couple of different paid subscription services available there, as well as over on therigdr.com, where we offer one-to-one consulting, and we sell all of our patch cables and pedalboard accessories there as well. And if you want a free way to support us, you can always head over to our podcast, where we have long-form versions of a lot of the same types of conversations we have right here on the channel that you can listen to on any of your favorite podcatchers, from Spotify to Apple. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure that you like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. And until next time, I'm Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects, and that was looking at what Jimi Hendrix might still be using if he were alive today. See you later.